I just want to say over and over again to people who are either in my situation or parents to people in my situation who feel fearful for your child, I don't regret anything about how I navigate the world. These things, although they are hardships that make us more complicated and rigorous and interesting people. I do think you just have to embrace this is the life. You occupy the life as fully as you can.
Welcome to the Don't Feed the Fear podcast, where we dive into the complex world of food allergy anxiety. I'm your host, Dr. Amanda Whitehouse, food allergy anxiety psychologist and food allergy mom. Whether you're dealing with allergies yourself or supporting someone who is, join us for an empathetic and informative journey toward food allergy calm and confidence. I am so excited to get to meet and have on the show my guest today, Sandra Beasley. She is the author of Don't Kill the Birthday Girl, Tales from an Allergic Life, a disability memoir about her own food allergies. Her nonfiction has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Psychology Today, The American Scholar, Virginia Quarterly Review, LitHub, and A Harp and the Stars, an anthology of lyric essays. She has also published 4 poetry collections, including Made to Explode, and she edited Vinegar and Char, verse from the Southern Foodways Alliance. Sandra's honors include an NEA Fellowship, the Munster Literature Center's John Montague Fellowship, and 6 D.C. Commission on the Arts and Humanities Fellowships. She lives in Washington, D.C. Sandra, thank you for joining me today to talk about your writing and your work and about your life managing allergies. I'm really happy to have you here.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Your book, Don't Kill the Birthday Girl, was published in 2011, and my son was diagnosed in 2012. So it was perfect timing for me in terms of finding your book when I needed it the most. And that's what this season of the podcast is all about. Where do we find support? It's not always people that we know in real life. You mentioned in your book taking refuge in books, and I do too. And so I'm excited to have the chance to thank you personally for sharing what you did. It really ties in your personal experiences with the topics that are important to know about and understand. You merged life experience with history and political issues and all those things really well in the book.
I really appreciate that. And one thing that I would mention is that I very consciously wrote the book into a gap that I saw, because years ago I had the opportunity to speak with a literary agent, and I went in there thinking I would like to try my hand at writing nonfiction. I'd only really published poetry up till that point. And I was talking about various topics for a book, and frankly, he wasn't that interested in X, Y, or Z. But when I mentioned the food allergies, he paused and he said, there might be something there. And when I went home from that meeting, I realized there really was a gap where there was a ton of very high science, fairly dense writing about food allergy, and then very, very practical, here's the recipes, here's the tips, self-help. But there wasn't anything that felt like a compelling, organic narrative of what the actual experience was like. And I thought, well, I would want to read that. And so I guess I have to write it. That would really open something up for me. And I will just say that the conversations I've had as a result of this book have been incredible, because all it takes is you offering up your own experience to just let people feel like they can finally offer up theirs in return.
Absolutely. I agree with you. I think we still see that gap, and maybe more people will continue to fill that in. I think I'm trying to do that with the podcast here and hoping to do that with you today, diving in a little bit deeper in conversation beyond kind of the surface level of experiences. I was hoping we could start just with the title. I won't say I love your title, but it's really powerful in depicting one of the themes that I think is of your book, how you're shaped by this experience. So would you mind telling us about how you came up with that?
Sure. I mean, I had in poetry written a sequence called Allergy Girl, and I came to working on a proposal for a memoir thinking that was going to be a variation of the title. And then as it got closer, I realized that wasn't quite doing enough to capture the values that I wanted. I wanted to show that this was going to, weirdly enough, be a book with a sense of humor. And so I tried to pull something from the memory bank of my childhood with food allergy that had a little bit of an element of the absurd. And I could just remember my mother's cheerful voice at birthday parties or at family celebrations where, everyone would partake in a dessert, and then she'd be like, don't kill the birthday girl, like just kind of hands off from Sandra, because we'd had the experience of like really great evening, and then at the end of the night, well-meaning relative just giving me a big fat kiss on the cheek, where just I would immediately get a hive, and so it felt like it had that right storytelling element that I really wanted to share with folks.
And it seems like you must have had to do a fair amount of research too, because you really do tie in a lot of factual information about allergies along with your experiences. What was that like, living it and then having to dive into learning about a different side of it?
Yeah. When I originally committed to writing the book, I really thought of it as a cultural history of food allergy with a little bit of memoir. And it became clear in the conversation with the publisher that what they wanted was a memoir with a bit of research and cultural history. And in some ways, there were kind of hardships of trying to do the research that I just didn't know enough to know that I was going to run into, like the fact that literally the word allergy wasn't coined until the 20th century. So you can't just do a neat word search and find, I mean, you can find the medical case histories that are relevant to food allergy once you know what to look for, but it's not as simple as a keyword search. And so I actually, years ago, studied science fairly seriously when I was a younger student and chose to go in the direction of creative writing and of English. And it was fun for me to go back into having that vocabulary, having to develop that ability to synthesize fairly dense studies and get the top line results, get a layman's understanding, and really think a lot about creating metaphors that could kind of transform and create understanding for anyone and not leave them feeling boxed out by the science or the degree of history, which in a way is what my allergist all those years ago had to do for me when I was like 5, 6 years old, trying to explain to a kid why their blood is quote unquote rejecting or attacking certain things as they eat them. So I was really felt a kinship with all the pediatric allergists in the world who are also trying to get pretty complex scientific information and make it palatable for the people who need it.
That makes me curious. How did you make that jump then with this interest in science that you had to becoming a writer?
When I moved forward in the world, what I realized was that I could pursue writing and always invite in the texture of science and nature and things I could research. In order to be a writer, you have to really commit to nourishing that community element too, going to readings, constantly kind of networking and moving through the world as a writer. And I think it would have been hard for me to maintain the poetry side of myself if I had fully pursued a profession in the sciences, honestly. So you kind of pick which one is going to be the primary and which one is going to be the secondary. And I just ultimately felt too called to books and literature.
I'm kind of shifting my perspective because I obviously read Don't Kill the Birthday Girl first and then found your poetry. But it sounds like you're saying you're a writer. That's just such a big
Mm-hmm.
part of you that you needed to do that. And did your life with allergies shape that?
I do think that my food allergy is central to who I am. I don't think of it as a compartmentalized thing or something that I would take away if I could. At this point, it's completely embedded in how I approach the world, which is in a very observant way, a very discerning way, I hope a very empathetic way. And those are all qualities that I think are essentially enriched by my experience with food allergy. I did take a long time to bring food allergy onto the page. It took me a really long time to think that that was something that was worthy of appearing in a poem or appearing in an essay. There's a lot of different reasons for that. Writing nonfiction is always hard, but I also think that there was a certain if you think about food allergy through a disability lens, I think early on some of my workshop experiences there might have been some what we would call ableist or some determination on focus on the upside, focus on the strengths about you. Why would you want to talk about a weakness? So it took me a while to claim it.
Looking back on it now, it's been about 14 years since you originally published the book. The allergy world information is changing so rapidly. What do you feel holds true, and what do you feel looks different to you now looking back?
So, as I mentioned, the book came in part out of a conversation with a literary agent, which was through a contest that I had won for my poetry. So, really kind of an odd. So, I have to be honest, this was not a book I had spent a number of years planning towards. This was a book where all of a sudden, in a matter of less than 6 months, I had a book contract with a year's deadline. So, I had to kind of very quickly calibrate how I was going to approach writing the book. That said, I was extraordinarily lucky in that period of 2008, 2009. I feel like we had a crest of understanding of the science of food allergy. The LEAP study was already in play. We didn't have results from it, but there was I think a very sophisticated way of talking about food allergy that was beginning to burgeon at that time. So I was fortunate in that when I went looking for studies, the studies were there. Now, of course, I wish I could have had access to the studies that came out in 2013 and 2017 and Leap On and all the things that we know now that we didn't know back then. And that I think is the forever frustration of choosing to write about the sciences or the medicalized body. You have to accept the reality that you do the best with what you can and the information you have at the time. It will continue to change out underneath you. And that's why where I had done a lifetime's worth of research was the personal stories. And that's no one could take those away from me. And I always try to say to people, it's a memoir, it's not a manual. I know that there are times where, as an individual in this book, I handle allergic reactions in ways that is probably a parent's worst nightmare to read, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And that to me was the ultimate responsibility I had, was to be as honest as possible, so that if that opened up a conversation between a parent and not even a child, but a teenager or a young adult, maybe those were conversations that needed to be had. And if someone didn't create the umbrella of being open, how could you create a shelter for those conversations?
Yeah, I agree. And I think in rereading it now, obviously it struck me so differently than it did then, because at the time I had a baby with allergies and I could control absolutely everything, and thought that, oh, well, my child would never, I would make sure my child knows not to do some of these things that now I'm reading them. And I have a 13-year-old are, you're right, anxiety provoking to read. But that's what I think we're both mentioning as far as diving deeper beyond the surface level discussions, because it does happen. Kids do feel these things as much as we try to educate them or what they have access to. And so I think it's really powerful for you to have shared that, despite, like you said, some of it is, it's tough to read the way that you handled certain things that you probably would not, I hope, do
Yeah.
today in your adult life.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to remember, I was thinking about the stories in my life that have happened after the book of written was came out, or even the stories that for whatever reason I didn't include in the book. And I was thinking about one thing which is years ago, like when I was a kid. I remember playing with my cat and like flicking kibble across the floor so the cat would chase it, and without a second thought, I popped a piece of the kibble into my mouth in the way that like a 6 or 7 year old might do.
Sure.
And a split second later thought, oh my God, this is a food. This is a food. And thankfully I didn't have a reaction in that moment, or at least not one that I can recall, but realizing later that yes, shrimp was one of the ingredients. Now at that point, if you're talking about a single bit of kibble, it's such an infinitesimal, but we know that even the smallest amount can cause a reaction, right? And so, gosh, are people thinking to talk to their young kids about making sure they know whether the pet food in the house has their food allergens in it? Kids are kids. You never know where they're going to find
Right.
those.
Well, and how telling that you, as a somewhere around 6-year-old, would even stop to think that, because obviously
Oh, yeah.
no other child who hasn't had this life experience would never cross their mind. Like, is it okay for me to eat
Yeah, I
this?
mean, how many kids bite into a dog biscuit at some point,
Right.
Practically a rite of passage.
I am yeah, absolutely. Well, and I should have probably asked earlier on, but maybe this is a good point for me to pause and have you tell people who are listening what your allergies are.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Dairy, which I usually am saying cow's milk, but the reality is I've had reactions to goat's milk and sheep's milk as well. And just recently, the FDA has kind of played around with its definitions of dairy to more capaciously include those considerations. Chicken, egg, beef, shrimp, macadamia, pistachios, cashews, pine nuts, which the first couple of times I ate them, I could eat them. And then I started having consistently and more severe reactions. Mango, cantaloupe. And that's always a pain because if you go to a hotel and there's an inexpensive free breakfast, the fruit salad always has honeydew and cantaloupe in it, which I am allergic to both of those. Cucumber. Mustard in the sense of Dijon mustard. I've never quite figured out if it's the issue as a egg as an emulsifier. The thing is that when you have allergies like mine and when you have a history of as many severe reactions as I do, and yes, I've gotten a couple of levels of testing over the years, but you hit a moment where, am I allergic to lobster? I don't know. I know I'm allergic to shrimp. And the idea of me being motivated to do an oral food challenge with lobster, which is a very expensive food in the first place, is very low. And so, there's a category of foods that it's very possible that I have allergies to, but honestly, at this point in my adult life, I might just never know. And information is powerful, and I know the importance of having that information. And what I don't necessarily want is the flip side of a child or a family studiously avoiding a food that if it turns out if an oral food challenge had been done, in fact, if a child could have eaten. I think this is just anecdotal, but I think my mom was reminding me the other day that I'm pretty sure that based on the initial what would have been like RAS testing or blood testing back then, it was claiming I was allergic to pineapple. And that's not something that ever manifested in an allergy. And in fact, it was proved wrong over and over again before. But if we had just gone forward with that one result, that could have been a whole lifetime of missing out. My trips to Hawaii would have not been nearly as fun, And so it is. I think that even with all of the improvements in science, we're still between a rock and a hard place. And all I can say is that I'm glad that there's. I think there's a lot of active attention to figuring out better options for diagnostics.
I agree, and in an informed way with the perspectives like what you've shared in mind, not without any consideration.
Yeah, I think that we have to be honest about the emotional and logistical time commitments and money commitments that involve families caring for a child's food allergy, with whether it's the diagnostic visits or treatments twice a month, or it's a tremendous, I don't want to say burden because I think you just embrace that it's part of living the life you have. But the costs are real and they're there, and even just the happenstance stuff adds up.
Yeah, the little things add up, which makes me want to ask you what's the biggest single thing looking back on your life? What was the biggest moment that really was traumatizing or stuck with you?
There was no one worst reaction that comes to mind. Even though I've over the years had reactions that were painful or embarrassing or mysterious in ways that were frustrating or expensive, but I never really thought of those as traumatizing. I do sometimes think with regret of the handful of things that I said no to, where I think really deep down it was anxiety related to food allergy. I was just thinking the other day about I got a sudden invite to go to an international poetry conference. I had just done a poetry reading in Cyprus, and I soon after got an invitation to go to and do a poetry festival in Turkey. And in hindsight, it was an amazing opportunity, but I wouldn't have had the same infrastructure of protections around me just because of the way it was organized. I just would have had less guarantees of a host or English speaker. And I just couldn't handle the stress of it, honestly. And those are the things that it's not trauma, but it is a degree of regret. And that's where I have to remind myself that there really are some life experiences that I've kind of missed out on or had in a more compromised manner because of my food allergy.
Is loss maybe a better word for it?
Yeah, and I think I ended up choosing not to have children, which is a question that's left open at the end of Don't Kill the Birthday Girl. And I still to this day am often in conversations where we'll be talking about food allergy best practices or options. And when you bring up the potential reality of being the parent with severe food allergy to a child who you're trying to help not have that food allergy, and you try to talk about early introduction, for example, to something that you yourself may be allergic to, a lot of times the answers are really not good. I mean not good as in they're not established. There's not really the language around it that you might wish that there was. And I think that's something that we as a culture can work on, but also um, I again, I consider my food allergy integral to who I am, but I don't think I'll ever quite know what it would have been like to weigh the decision of whether or not to have kids if I hadn't had these allergies.
Right. You can't remove that
Yeah.
from the whole of who you are.
Hmm.
Well, and you mentioned just now and touched earlier too on how the process of writing the memoir and putting the allergies on the page for the first time with the poetry. When in my field in mental health, we talk a lot about how narrative therapy can be helpful and about how putting your experiences together into a coherent story helps shape your sense of who you are and process and integrate them. Did there come a time when you realized that's what you were about to do, or was it in retrospect? Can you talk about the experience of doing that through your writing?
I did my graduate studies in creative writing at American University, and there's a teacher and writer. He's passed away now, but his name was Richard McCann. And Richard was the recipient of a liver transplant and had written about that. And I kind of had this notion towards the very, very, very end, my thesis semester in the graduate program, like maybe I should try writing about my allergies. And he was my advisor on my thesis. And I'm so grateful in hindsight because he was a great sounding board for what I was struggling with, which was trying to figure out how to use a slightly technical vocabulary of something like immunoglobulin or something like that. But I liked the stickiness of words like that, but I also recognized that it was a fragile balance to use a word like that in a poem and how to do that mix of movements. And it was something that he had to think about in his essays about the transplant experience and in general his health. So that kind of lured me in. And that is something I think about a lot as a teacher. I'm not doing teaching as my primary income, but there have been years of my life where it has been. And I often think about just holding open the door for someone else who wants to write about the medicalized body, but just needs to be in dialogue with someone who knows what it's like. It makes a huge difference. The only thing I'll say in terms of writing about it in poetry versus prose is that poetry is often a space where you do open up to melancholy. Back when I was in my dating days, if someone said, "Well, why don't I ever show up in your poems?" I'm like, "If you're showing up in our poems, this is probably not a good sign for our relationship." This really, And similarly, I think what's interesting is in the couple of small cameos that parents, I'm not going to say my parents because poems don't necessarily have that stipulative truth value, but parents in the food allergy poems, it's often in a place of kind of fraughtness, melancholy, or stress. And yet in Don't Kill the Birthday Girl, and I'm glad I got to do this, I got to show my parents, because that's a memoir, in a really appreciative light. Because the reality is, whatever stresses my family was encountering over the years, it almost always brought out the best in them when I was dealing with my allergies. I really appreciate that. I know that's not necessarily the case for every family, but in many cases it was.
Yeah, which is it's such a complex thing to explore. You shared an essay with me, and if it's okay, I'll link it. And the essay, I'll let you summarize it because it's too complex for me to even do. But it going from the summary that you just said about always being able to see that their best light, their best self shine through when you needed them, but yet to explore the complexities the way you did in the essay that you shared with me, parents who are listening to process and really be mindful and conscious about how they're filling their role as an allergy parent, not just managing the day to day. At least that's what it brought up themes of for me. And I will warn people, if you want to read when you have time to really process, because it's not a fluff piece. It's complicated, and I applaud you for tackling it. Can you talk about that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so what I just said is true, which is that I think my mother, in her capacity to learn, to self-educate about food allergy, I mean, again, this was the 80s. There was so much less information than there is now. So to self-educate, to be on the lookout for me, to get at the technical levels of food and treatment and reactions, to be brave when I was reacting and needed someone to feel like they were in charge and that I was protected. All of that is great. But that anxiety and stress doesn't, that doesn't disappear. It gets, ends up being saved up and perhaps expressing itself in other times, in other settings where in that moment you're not necessarily in the superhero adrenaline mode of protecting your child, but you're just a flawed human making your way through the world. And, and bless my mother for reading that essay and letting me publish it, because it does capture some of the inevitable pressure valves that have to be released when you're a food allergy parent, I think. Yeah, so that's, it's about mothers and daughters. It's about food allergy anxiety. It goes back a generation and talks about my grandmother and her mother as figures as well, although their story doesn't have food allergy in it. And it's just really thinking about caregiving. And the thing that I'll disclose, just because it's in the work that I'm doing now, is that literally the day after I finished writing that essay, I wrote that essay in Alaska. And the day after I finished it, I got the call that my husband was back at home in DC in the hospital. And he was, in fact, within 24 hours on ECMO. So he was extremely ill and ended up being in the ICU for 3 weeks. And my point is that I ended up having to go through this searing discussion of caregiving on the page. And then I went home and all of a sudden was the caregiver. And in fact, actually, my mother slept on my couch for a week to help me just get my life together, because my husband experienced multiple organ failure. And part of what I'm writing about now is trying to reconcile the reality that came to him, which was living with a renal diet and a cardiac diet. And I thought I was going to spend my life with me as the one with the dietary challenges. And of course, mine haven't gone away. But now we're a household of two sets of dietary restrictions and a need to create mutual caregiving. And so thinking a lot about that. And the anxiety. Don't forget the anxiety.
Oh, well, yes, so much anxiety to go around. It's such a powerful picture for me as a mom, thinking of you writing that piece about your mom and how that anxiety manifested for her, and then to come home to her sleeping on your couch to support you through now you having a mirrored experience, as you said, being the caregiver. For me, that was one of the strongest connecting factors for me with my own mom. Different thing, but my sister had juvenile diabetes. So in a way that many people couldn't understand, she was able to relate to this idea of caregiving in a way that other people might not be able to. Keep your child safe. And that, I've processed that a lot, and your essay helped me with that as well, in terms of the impact it has on our relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm glad. It's interesting that you mentioned juvenile diabetes. One of the things that, if I could go back in time and, not rewrite the book, but if I could just counsel myself as I was writing the book, I felt at the time a great deal of pressure to differentiate and make food allergies stand out. And I think that was something my publisher wanted me to do. And the only thing that, especially as I eventually came to think about food allergy more through the disability lens, I wish that, there were times in the book where I was trying to really differentiate, for example, wheat allergy from celiac, from, gluten intolerance, or thinking about I wish I had been able to spend a little bit more time celebrating the similar struggles and the potential for combined empowerment versus some of the places where I feel like I ended up, just pointing out, here's how we're special, here's how we're different, and again, that's just maybe a maturity thing, but it was really brought home by the fact that after the book came out, I had so many powerful conversations with people, one of whom who comes to mind, who's coming from the diabetes world. And I just thought, oh man, like I would hate for them to read this book and feel excluded from it. I even felt that way a little bit with folks with peanut allergy, because I talked a lot about the ways in which, by the larger public, peanut allergy got lifted up and made the figurehead allergy. I mean, to this day, the myth that peanut allergies are more serious than any other allergy persists. But that is not the fault of people with peanut allergy, right? I would hate for someone with peanut allergy to enter my book and to any way feel left out, because it's not something that I personally had experienced and couldn't speak to with the same passion. But I get the concern and I get the anxiety. The irony was, when they designed the paperback for my book, they put a picture of a peanut on the back. Maybe someone who hadn't actually read the book, but that's okay.
I was going to say, did they read the book?
Nope.
Well, and the way you're describing this, just from a personal experience, it didn't come across that way to me, at least as a parent with a child with peanut tree nut, and then we added sesame later. But initially, it seemed pretty simple. It was just nuts. When you were talking about flying and your experience flying, and should we eliminate peanuts from planes, but should we eliminate all of everyone's allergens for planes? And it's just complicated. And I would say your book helped me to realize that when I was in this fear state of like, get the peanuts out of everywhere, not actually being realistic or necessarily fair.
Yeah, I think that that is a very real issue. I mean, I certainly have had the anxiety of sitting down on a plane and having someone unwrapping a spectacularly cheesy sandwich that they bought at the airport right next to me. And I just have to stay centered in that moment and know that I have things that I am empowered to do to keep myself feeling comfortable and safe. And, and look, you can't rely on personal anecdote, but I never have had a reaction from that type of adjacency. I'm not going to say exposure, but adjacency. And all I can say is I hope the same for any family with tree nut allergy or peanut allergy. But I also know it's harder with real little kids, because real little kids will reach out and grab something and be oblivious to to whether or not what they're putting in their mouths. So that when you are in a space like a plane, that can be very scary. And I definitely think we can do better in terms of epinephrine supply on planes. I absolutely think there needs to be allergy dosed epinephrine on every single airplane. And, one of the things that when I did Don't Kill the Birthday Girl, I didn't even fully appreciate was the issues right now of, even when they say there is epinephrine on a plane, a lot of times it's not dosed for allergy. It might be dosed for cardiac. You need to be a medical professional to handle, a syringe and needle comfortably. There's all of these things that could be so much better than they are right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would add to that, not just the accessibility on planes, but everywhere. I think there's so much room to have stock epi in every school, on every ambulance, every first responder vehicle. Like, there are so many places where it's just such an easy and inexpensive thing to have on hand. So I echo that for sure.
Yeah.
We moved away from the piece that you were talking about with adjusting to this new life with your husband, and now his dietary needs and kind of that caregiving role that's so different.
I'm still working my way through the material just to kind of give it a fleshed out exemplar. He is fortunately not on dialysis right now, but when he was on dialysis and he was really struggling with his energy levels, they were pretty blunt about the fact that, eggs for breakfast on a day that he had dialysis was going to be an excellent resource. Now, when we got married, we created a household that didn't have eggs in it, didn't have milk in it, didn't have these things that I was allergic to, just to make it practical and easy, right? Mm-hmm. So things had to come into my fridge that had not been in my fridge before. and then in accordance, there were things that we had previously loved to share, like citrus, like just, he's a Florida boy, and just little things like that all of a sudden we couldn't. Tomatoes, we couldn't, so in the same way that I might have some areas of the world that I would hesitate to travel to because the use of cheese is particularly permeating, he now might not choose to not be as excited to go somewhere where tomatoes are served left and right. So you just kind of have to, you have to grow with one another and you have to adapt. Same thing, I can remember being horrified when some of my food allergic reactions had me in the bathroom for, an hour or something like that, or just scared or uncomfortable. Now he's the one who might find himself, dealing with a kidney stone, for example. We've had to get to know each other's lives because of these medicalized bodies in a way that I think ultimately many marriages do require, but maybe a little faster and under slightly more tense circumstances than
Right.
otherwise.
And yeah, more dangerous, more serious in terms of the health implications.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, just one of the things that when I started talking about food allergies, I thought it was so important to talk about was food allergies and alcohol. And that was because a lot of times the heaviness of advice and guidelines dropped away right as people with food allergies entered their young adult years and could legally drink, and I don't think a lot of parents really were having frank conversations about how when you put alcohol in the mix, it would get more complicated. You can talk about that from the angle of the alcohol literally exacerbating a reaction. You can talk about the danger of combining alcohol with antihistamines. You can talk about the fact that bar and restaurant menus are inconsistent with labeling for food allergens in the alcohols themselves or in the garnishes. The fact that the ways garnishes are handled at the bar doesn't necessarily guard against cross contact. I mean, it's just it's a huge topic. Um, I thought that was a place where my voice could really make a difference. Ironically, one of the things about what my husband's dealing with now is that he can't drink anymore, and that's kind of too bad because there have been so many times where I've been in a space where because of my allergies, I really couldn't freely enjoy what everyone else was eating, but I did have the opportunity to be able to drink what alongside everyone else, and now I'm trying to figure out how to negotiate that with someone for whom it's no longer medically an option.
Right. It's a good example of how over time people always ask about coping skills. How do you cope with your allergies? But yours have probably shifted over the years, and then in this instance probably shifted again the most quickly and drastically. I don't keep it in the house. It relieves my anxiety about exposure because it's not in the house, but now you need to have it. And here's how I cope with social situations. I have a drink if I can't eat and I don't feel left out. And now your spouse has to come at it from the opposite direction.
Yeah, I just think these lives are complicated, and again, I just go back to yes, do I carry more levels of anxiety or unusual levels of anxiety or anxiety attached to things that other people take for granted? Yes, I do. But I just want to say over and over again to people who are either in my situation or parents to people in my situation who feel fearful for your child, I don't regret anything about how I navigate the world. Like, I don't, these things, although they are hardships that make us more complicated and rigorous and interesting people. And, I'm not going to go so far as to put a silver lining on what's happened for my husband. That's definitely not my place to do. But I do think you just have to embrace this is the life, you occupy the life as fully as you can. And you learn and you learn. And for me, like the best guardian against anxiety is always knowledge.
Absolutely. Knowledge gives us control, right? Knowledge gives us some aspect of an experience that we can control.
Yeah.
I did get a couple of questions from readers. I've been
Oh,
trying to pepper
yeah.
them. I know I touched on some of them. One of them asked on the note that you just finished on, what is a surprising thing that you've learned about yourself through both allergies and through your writing?
Mm. People like to often typify writers and particularly poets as introverts. And the process of being a writer in the world has absolutely brought out my extrovert tendencies hugely. And I say that on multiple levels. I say that based on the years that I was writing about external subjects, and so I was interviewing musicians, for example, and really had to do things like go get sound bites and stop people and ask them questions. But the many places where I've appeared on a stage or in an audience and been sharing from my work and answering questions, I deeply love being around people. I'm charged up by people. And that is not something I think I fully understood about myself until I embraced the identity of being a writer. So it requires trust, I would just add, it's ironic that I've chosen something that requires as much travel and as much being hosted by other people given my food allergies. Definitely have had the scenario of showing up to events where someone had very carefully catered something at which I could not eat a thing. Definitely. But I've also had the opposite. I've had, very, very attentive, and I don't take it personally either way. It's just funny. But so I think discovering my extrovert qualities, discovering trying to be funny, discovering that you have to always be open to the absurdity in painful moments as a coping mechanism, but a little better than that, a living mechanism when you're dealing with medical crises. I mean, that's something that the fact that my husband and I already had a baseline of being able to joke about fairly grim medical circumstances based on my food allergies came in really handy in the ICU some days. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioning that about humor and being able to take that approach to it makes me think of you using your poetry as a method of doing that. Your poetry speaks for itself in terms of using humor in the ways that you're describing. I was wondering if you would mind reading one of your poems for us about
Yeah.
allergies.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that I was on the front end of is I talk about in Don't Kill the Birthday Girl, watching a couple of different movies or TV shows where food allergy was used as a punchline, right? And I would love to say that is no longer the case, but man, I keep getting new examples to add. I was binge watching Smash while my husband was on a trip recently, and towards the end of season one, and there's two seasons, so this is not a spoiler totally, but there's a character who's introduced, and first time her peanut allergy was mentioned in a restaurant, I was like, oh, because there actually ended up being a pretty intelligent, informed discussion about, well, if you're in this part of India, the cuisine is more likely to have it, but in this part it's less. And I thought, well, that's actually a very sensitive, like, gosh, does someone on the staff think about peanut allergy? Or but then it was mentioned in another episode where she had to run out for like safe, and I was like, ooh. And I couldn't stop myself. I had been enjoying the show in real time, but I immediately looked up the episode summaries. I was like, there's going to be an allergic reaction, and it's going to be either a humor point or a suspense point. And sure enough, it becomes this whole circumstance under which, she has to leave the show, and it causes, and someone is intentionally, quote unquote, poisoned her shake with powder, and then she's like, but actually, I ate it intentionally because I didn't want to be in the point was the moment I saw enough of the signals, I was like, well, now I know what's going to happen, right? And
It's
anyone
coming.
with food allergy, I think, can recognize that kind of so the poem that I want to read is one that's in dialogue with that, because there have been times over the years where someone has come up to me and said, I think you're going to love, and it's a book or a movie or a TV show, and invariably it's like someone being victimized through their food allergy. It's like, what made you think that I would be so excited to see that example? So yeah, this poem is called Death by Chocolate. There's a tradition in the literary world where we write little endorsements for each other's books. They're called blurbs. This may or may not be based on an actual request for a blurb that I received. Death by Chocolate. A man wants my take on his novel, where a wife dies with a peanut in her mouth after we've met her husband in the act with his secretary in the passenger seat of a late life convertible. A man wants my take on his novel, where the husband's marital issues are solved by her anaphylactic collapse after he serves her takeout spiked with a cashew. And for another 300 pages, he wonders, was it an accident or did I know? Somewhere out there, a man is writing a novel about a chef with a taste for adding shrimp paste to curry and his unsuspecting shellfish allergic wife, and I will be asked for my take on it. I have been offered dozens of takes on my own death. Suggestions abound: death by ice cream, death by cake, death by cucumber, though that would take a while, perhaps gazpacho as a shortcut. Death by mango, death by Spanish omelet, death by dairy, an abstraction sexy to someone who has never side-eyed, cream brought out slopping toward the coffee, who has never felt histamine's palm at her throat, who says, Cheese makes life worth living. These wives, I get you, women who did not grow up aspiring to be a plot device. We almost die a lot, or we die a lot, almost. We're over it. Our mouths have more to say.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Showing us how much more you've become than a plot device, right? Or just this girl confined to a memoir about her food allergies. And for those who are listening, we mentioned your memoir, but not your poetry books, which are Made to Explode, Theories of Falling, I Was the Jukebox, and Count the Waves. Those are probably out of chronological order of publication, but I have
Well,
them in a pile here on my desk.
yeah, it's actually great the way you mentioned them because Theories of Falling, my first book, really has the food allergy poems that relate to a kind of childhood and young adult persona. So a more straight hand recollecting from memory. The food allergy poems in Made to Explode, I think, are really taking a step towards looking at it through the lens of disability rights, and thinking about the ways in which the problem is not always necessarily the food allergy, but the societal attitudes around the food allergy.
Well, thank you so much for bringing so much light to that and explaining it with so much more depth than we usually get to hear. You couldn't have been kinder in this whole process. And I love hearing your take and your perspective on things and how vulnerably you share your experiences with the world through your writing.
Well, thank you for this podcast. I just think that these are conversations that people want to be having, need to be having, and it's not the same conversation over and over. There's so many nuances and layers to what people need to share. So I really appreciate what you're doing.
Well, thank you. I would love to have you back when your next book is ready for people to read. Will you keep me posted and we'll all follow you along? Tell us where we can find you on social media. Where's the best place to buy your books?
Yeah, we'll always support your local bookstore. So like in the DC area, that includes a few different, we're great for bookstores, but Politics and Prose, I love. My books are fairly widely available, and I am all over the social media platforms, although like many, I don't always post as regularly as I have in the past, but just look for me at Sandra Beasley or at Sandra Beasley author Sandra Beasley. And I'm always happy to engage with people one-on-one on social media, or really even just by email. I'm findable.
Very easy for me to find and very responsive. So thank you so much for being so receptive.
Thank you.
Here are your 3 action steps to follow up on today's conversation. Number 1, check out Sandra Beasley on social media at Sandra Beasley. She's very easy to find and very responsive, as she said in the episode. Number 2, read her memoir or her poetry. They're easy to find online. I prefer to use bookshop.org to support independent bookstores, and you'll find a link to that in the notes, as well as a link to the essay we discussed from Sandra's upcoming book. The essay is also very easy to find if you search for To Catch a Sunset on The American Scholar. Number 3, follow Sandra's beautiful lead and do some narrative therapy. Writing can be so healing and powerful for processing difficult experiences and integrating them into our sense of self. In psychology, we call this narrative therapy, and it is an evidence-based approach to healing trauma. A simple practice is to write a letter to your younger self, reflecting on a past experience, your thoughts and feelings at the time, and how it looks and feels to you from your current vantage point. If you're a young person listening or want to encourage a young person in your life to try this, an alternative is to flip this and to imagine your older self looking back on the experiences now, once you are an older, wiser, more mature and experienced person, and what you imagine you'd say about it years down the road. Once you're done, you can save it in a journal, you can burn it, you can rip it up. There are no rules, but I hope you'll give it a try. The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional medical or mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you have any questions about your own medical experience or mental health needs, please consult a professional. I'm Dr. Amanda Whitehouse. Thanks for joining me. And until we chat again, remember, don't feed fear.